Doctor Who Season by Season. New Who Series 4 Review. Series 4 of televised fan-fiction New Who aired in 2008. It was the third season to star David Tennant as the 10th Doctor, the fourth to be overseen by showrunner Russell T Davies, and the only full season to star Catherine Tate as Donna Noble. Prior to the season, of course, was the 2007 Christmas special, Voyage of the Damned. New Who Christmas specials today have a reputation slightly lower than dog shit, yet the first two weren't actually that bad. So where did that reputation begin? Well, to be blunt, it began with this utter irredeemable piece of garbage. Voyage of the Damned is one of the worst Doctor Who stories ever made, and perhaps the defining moment when the new series lost complete control of itself or any resemblance whatsoever to the original series. You'll have to forgive me, I'm reviewing this sputum from memory as I have not seen it for a very long time and indeed underwent intensive psychological counseling to try and rid myself of any memory of it. All I do remember is a flying Titanic, Kylie Minogue being awful, two fat people being comically fat, and the Doctor getting lifted to the heavens by two angels and walking away from flames in slow motion in a hilariously cringeworthy moment. Oh, and I do remember a couple of good bits, but since they were ripped off wholesale from the Robots of Death, I don't think they really count. Voyage of the Damned marked the moment the Christmas specials turned to crap, and they've never recovered since. But never mind. Surely Series 4 itself would be better? I mean, I may have hated Series 2 with the fiery passion of 1,000 suns, but Series 3 was actually pretty good for the most part, so surely things could only get better? The season begins with the hilarious comedy romp Partners in Crime. At least, that's how it was described in fan reviews at the time. That didn't quite sum up my view of the thing, of course, which was that it was one of the most crass, irritating, embarrassing, painfully unfunny pieces of shit to go out under the name of Doctor Who since, at least the Christmas special. I hated this episode, I thought it was absolutely dire shit and my opinion has not changed. Really bad television and fucking appalling Doctor Who. This did not exactly get Series 4 off to a stellar start, and after two shit cans in a row, my enthusiasm was on the wane. But surely the fires of Pompeii would be no better, right? I mean, it's a historical-based one, and even New Who at this point had a pretty good track record when it comes to them. I was sure I'd enjoyed that one at least. I was wrong. The Fires of Pompeii is bad. In fact, it's not just bad, it's bad on the same staggeringly inane, awful, tear-your-face-off kind of bad as the previous two episodes. This story seems unable to decide if it wants to be a Gareth Roberts comic historical, a traditional Doctor Who pseudo-historical monster bash, or a straight-faced and grim Hartnell historical, and rather unwisely instead attempts to be all three within the space of 45 minutes. Needless to say, it doesn't work. The story is all over the place, and while the production values are great, it doesn't matter a damn when the script is so shit. The last 10 minutes seem to largely consist of Tennant and Tate shrieking at one another shrilly while Murray Gold's music blares out ever louder over the top of them, and the overall cumulative effect on this viewer's nerves at least is not dissimilar to nails going down a fucking blackboard. Absolutely hideous. Oh yes, and Peter Capaldi's in it. I don't give a shit. Karen Gillan's in it too, which is moderately more interesting. But I can't sit through this garbage even for Katsa. No offense, still love you, sweetheart. Call me. The next story is Planet of the Ood, and thank fuck Series 4 finally delivers something that isn't complete and utter shit. In fact, Planet of the Ood is, frankly shockingly at this point, actually very good indeed. It has an excellent script and excellent direction from Graham Harper, which together make this episode a sort of hybrid between the moral spacey stories of the Jon Pertwee era and the grittier and nastier style of early Colin Baker, otherwise known as Season 22. The great Tim Sinnany is also excellent as the villain, who despite the futuristic and alien world setting is a rather more real-world kind of villain than is usual in Who. That the climax is agreeably gruesome and visceral also feels decidedly unusual for the normally boringly sanitized new series and is very much appreciated. I've had some people whining about the dubious likelihood of the Ood's physiology, but fuck me people, they're aliens in an SF show. If an interesting bit of speculation about alien biology is too much for you, perhaps you should stick to Anten December fuck me. The next story is the two-part The Sontaran Strateam, by Helen Rayner, who also wrote the series 3 two-parter Daleks in Manhattan. This story marks the first appearance of the potato-headed villains since the Two Doctors 23 years earlier and is a bit of a mixed bag. It's easily the weakest real Sontaran story, in other words not one of those silly fucking things with fucking Strax in, and it's not as good as Planet of the Ood but it's still a hell of a lot better than Voyage, Partners, and Pompeii, which get my vote as the worst 3 consecutive stories in Who history. Rayner clearly took the OTT and don't get it causeway thick as pig shit criticism of her previous story by fandom to heart, because sadly Strateam is nowhere near as quirky or interesting as her previous story and is so generic you could practically take it off the peg. But it's passably entertaining in a switch your brain off kind of way, and Christopher Ryan, while certainly no Kevin Lindsay, is still pretty damn good as the main baddie Sontaran. I find it watchable and inoffensive enough all told. The next story is The Doctor's Daughter. After one very good and one entertaining enough story, was Series 4 getting back on track following its disastrous opening? Was it fuck? The Doctor's Daughter is another staggeringly shit piece of work, an inept ill-thought-out bit of juvenile sci-fi that embarrassingly attempts to be a character piece by giving the Doctor a daughter. Except, she's not his daughter, she's a sort of clone, and his genetic material was stolen from him against his will to make her, so he has approximately zero responsibility toward her. So what the fuck was the point of all this crap then? Georgia Moffat is annoying in the role though undeniably pretty fit, and her screen dad obviously thought so tee-hee. But really, this is thin, desperate, this week's stuff that really does suggest that the Davis era is running on fumes and it's time for him to go. To be fair, at least he pretty much did go after this, as opposed to Moffat, who's hung on for 5 years after he ran dry on ideas and is still going to be with us next year. Mommy, make it stop mommy. The next story is The Unicorn and Their Wasp, which is pretty weak in and of itself. This fairly lame Agatha Christie parody is not as bad as many of this season's episodes, and is mildly amusing in spots, but it's still pretty weak and empty. I still laugh at Doctor Who magazine's embarrassing attempt to bumfuck this episode and New Who by ejaculating wildly over this crap in the same issue as they slag off Black Orchid, a Peter Davison and Christie style story that, unlike this, is actually serious and above all very good. What a bunch of disingenuous ass-licking cunts they were, and probably still are for all I know, given I stopped reading the Cardiff propaganda sheet years ago. But I digress. The next story is The Silence in the Library two-parter from Stephen Moffat. Yay, a Moffat story. Yay, a Moffat story in the days when a Moffat story was something to cheer over and look forward to rather than roll your eyes in disdain and mumble what the hell is he going to fuck up this time? Funnily enough however, Silence is definitely Moffat's weakest story to this point, though it's not helped by some fairly iffy direction. The choice to film in a real library rather than a specially constructed set also rather backfires, as the place just doesn't have the kind of atmosphere you really need for what should be, at least in part, a claustrophobic horror story. For all that this was Moffat's weakest at this point, it's still light years ahead of most of this season and is a generally very enjoyable piece of work. It also, of course, features the first appearance of River Song, but let's just quietly draw a veil over that and move on with our lives, okay? The next story is Midnight. Given that old Rusty's last 2 scripts were as shit as something very shit indeed, you could be forgiven for thinking that I would hate this one, or at least have been dreading it. Yet I wasn't, not least because I had a kind of feeling this might be good from the DWM preview, and fuck me if it actually was. In fact, Midnight is almost certainly the best episode of the season. It's intense, it's fucked up, it's deliriously crazy, fantastically well acted, and the 10th Doctor getting his long-deserved comeuppance for being such a smug prick so much of the time turns out to be less satisfying and rather more frightening than we were probably expecting. Kudos all round for this one. The next story is Turn Left, which is rated almost as highly by fandom as Midnight, but one I don't like anywhere near as much, to be honest. The idea is interesting enough, if nothing more than an obvious riff on the Buffy Season 3 episode The Wish, which it is, needless to say, nowhere near the same league as, and Catherine Tate gives her best performance of the season, but it all feels a bit flat somehow. I don't hate it or anything, but it's not one I rush to watch too often either. Of course, this episode also sees the return of Billie Piper as Rose, who appears to have gained a new personality to go along with her new teeth, even though she'll be back to normal in the next story. Okay then. The next story is the two-part season finale, which I refer to simply as Journey's End. Oh boy. I'm going to need a stiff drink for this one. To be fair, the first episode isn't too bad. It's bad, no doubt about it, in a thoroughly worse kind of dumbest Hollywood blockbuster CGI-laden shite kind of way, but it's not too bad. It's the second episode, the one actually called Journey's End, which at the time got my vote as the very worst episode of Doctor Who ever filmed or broadcast anywhere ever. It may well have been topped since, but I didn't actually sit through Death in Heaven or Hell Bent, so I couldn't really say. But make no mistake, this episode is the pits. It's reminiscent of the Time Monster in being the kind of shit where it is impossible to recall just how fucking awful it is until you actually put it on, a mistake I'm happy to say I have not made for a very long time and never will again. The endless shrill noise, the overloaded CGI, the simply awful script, Rose getting her own toy sex blow-up doll Doctor, the Doctor getting a lecture on morality from fucking Davros of all people, and not refuting his points with an eloquent speech like any classic Doctor worth shit would have done, but just standing there and looking like he's going to blub like an absolute massive fucking pussy. Holy fuck. Don't even get me started on Dr. Donna or Davis shamelessly ripping off the end of the War Games for Donna's departure either. This episode is just one giant endless smorgasbord of effluent. It's an absolute dire piece of television and down there at the very bottom of any sane story poll. The twin dilemma fucking pisses all over this piece of garbage from a very great height, and I'd rather watch that story 200 times in succession than ever force myself to squirm through this again. Absolutely fucking dire, and an appalling end to a spectacularly inconsistent season. Series 4 veers from just about passable to pretty good to, very rarely, excellent to, very commonly, absolutely terrible. Tennant is also pretty annoying in this season, mugging to the camera like there's no tomorrow, and not helped by the partnership with Tate, whose own mugging seems to encourage him to further caricaturize himself. In spite of a couple of highlights, this is a pretty bad season. Not quite as bad as Series 2, and certainly not as bad as the post-Series 6 Moffat era, but still pretty bad. Series 4 of fan fiction New Who gets a D from me.